My name's John Bone from the University of Aberdeen, and I want to talk very briefly, provide a brief overview of a paper I've recently published in the British Journal of Sociology. And in a nutshell, what the paper basically does is provide a reappraisal of how we understand neoliberalism in the current era and its impact through the lens of a biosocial model that I've been developing for some time, to generate a new understanding of the implications of contemporary neoliberalism in the digital age for individuals and collectives. Now, I'm not going to go in and start talking about definitions of neoliberalism. Because of the time involved, I want to get straight into the argument. So, how have I characterised neoliberalism in the current era, and why have I done this? Well, I've adopted a set of concepts that have been circulating in the business community, and I've applied them to society, to social setting, because they seem to me to resonate with ideas that implied that contemporary society was far more, let's say, deregulated, destructured, confusing than the kind of theoretical models of neoliberalism that pertained in sociology from people like Beck or Bauman and so on. And the reason for that is that many of these models came when the digital revolution was very much in its infancy and pre-social media. And this has got implications for how we understand the contemporary neoliberal world and how it's developed. So the concepts I've used are volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity, together forming a concept called VUCA. And I've characterised the contemporary world as being a VUCA world. It's dominated by this volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity. Now, in the paper, I outline various aspects of society under these four headings. But given the time that's involved, I just wanted to give a whistle-stop tour of some of the main things I'm talking about. So we're talking about an ever faster pace of everyday living, faster than was depicted by previous theorists. Rapid socio-economic change. So we've moved on to the period of the what's called the Industrial Revolution 4.0, the automation of work. Work has become more digitalised. People are working in digital platforms, the gig economy and so on. This made work more insecure. Also, financialisation. Financialisation evidently has emerged from the outset with neoliberalism, but it's intensified. And together with the developments in digitalisation, it's made labour markets more insecure, so people have less secure jobs, and also financialisation applied to housing. We know that what happened with the credit crisis, and since housing has become less accessible to succeeding generations, and it's also become more insecure. And this is also occurred in a context of increasing competition and increasing visibility of competition in a more unequal world. So we have the visibility of competition through social media, a hyper-competitive world that sort of presents inequality to people in a very stark way. And because they've internalised a notion of meritocracy that pervades our society, that people's position in this society is defined by their talents and their effort, they individualise their failings or their perceived failings. So rather than attributing to losing out in this hyper-competitive, unequal world of likes and world of status anxiety, they tend not to see that this is due to a lack of opportunity or their structural position within society, but they see this in terms of their own failings, their own lack of talent or effort. And that compounds the insecurities of contemporary society, as does the decline of community. We become more atomised, and the decline of state support. Within this context, as adding to this kind of emotional and cognitive fugue, we have information overload. the web, we're bombarded with lots of information, and lots of it's also conflicting and contradictory, producing cognitive dissonance. Also, there's a dark side to this, because the way in which the web works in terms of its algorithms, the way social media works in terms of its algorithms, is also pushing people down rabbit holes. To engage with radicalised discourses and irrational discourses. And this has fermented a kind of post-truth politics, has people engaging with conspiracy theories that are highly irrational, and populist discourses that promise them a sense of identity, a positive sense of identity, that promise them a sense of community, and also give them, provide them with scapegoats to dump their negative feelings on. So, and they're manipulated from that perspective, given their cognitive and emotional state. So where does this cognitive emotional state come from? Well, my model, I've been developing a biosocial model over the last almost 2 decades, because I considered that the theoretical models, or when we started to go into psychology as sociologists, much of it's been from psychoanalysis, which is now passé. As far as I'm concerned, people will disagree, but I think it's passé. We now understand a lot about, now there's still some mysteries, but we now understand a lot about how we engage with the world, about the brain, from the decade of the brain and so on. And my model draws on this. So it starts off from the point of view that when we're building, we have to internalise a model of the world we engage with. Why? Because of the prefrontal cortex. Now this is implicated. The brain's a concerto, but this is the bit that's most implicated in higher level cognition, rational thought, reflection and so on, and conscious decision making and conscious perception, but it's got a very limited capacity. We can only deal with so many things consciously at a given time. We're very, very limited in that regard. So what we've got to do is build an internalised model of the world that allows us to engage with most things at a low level of consciousness. And this is how society is structured. And how this arises is that through emotional areas like the amygdala and other subcortical areas, as we experience the world, we experience emotional arousal, either negative or positive, depending on the experience. And when this happens, these subcortical regions in the amygdala stimulate an area of the brain called the hippocampus to lay down long-term memories of these experiences, whether positive or negative, and how we might engage with them in future. Now, this goes back way into our evolutionary past, when we mapped our geographical environment and the opportunities and threats within that environment. And there's increasing evidence that the life world we talk about is built on that capacity. So that's why I call this the social map. Effectively, we map our world, including our social world. And what human beings have done is built a more elaborated map that includes the social, with the opportunities and threats we've experienced in the past, and the meanings and the social norms and values and rules. And we've internalised this so that we can engage with it at a low level of consciousness, leaving the PFC free to engage with things that that are signalled to us as being important at any given time. Now, there is a problem, because the PFC has that bottleneck. And if it's overwhelmed, we experience what George Zimmelwatch calls nervous exhaustion. We're constantly, particularly in modern societies, open to emotional overload, to cognitive overload that produces negative emotional arousal. Why? Because if there's too many things happening, we may be missing opportunities and threats, and we experience that in terms of negative emotional arousal. So this drives us to classify, to rationalise, to routinise and structure our experiences such that we feel a sense of control over them. Now, control is very important. So what we want to do is avoid negative emotional arousal. And this would suggest, perhaps, that we want a world that's extremely bureaucratic and highly routinized. But there's an equilibrium here, there's a balance. So we want enough emotional arousal to make life meaningful. We want enough emotional arousal so that we understand the contours of our world, but not so much that we feel out of control, because we experience that as danger, as a threat. Negative emotional arousal. And these are the conditions that I'm talking about arise in the VUCA world. So what are the consequences? Well, I'd use another term here, primalisation. And I also draw on the biological to understand this, because the conditions of living in the VUCA world create chronic stress. And, you know, lots of writers have talked about this in the past in relation to neoliberalism. But one of the things they haven't understood is that chronic stress, negative emotional arousal, actually affects the functioning of the prefrontal cortex and our capacity for reasonable, rational thought. We become susceptible to amygdala hijack, to emotions of fear and anger overriding our reasoned responses. And this also stimulates us to distrust others. In this emotional state, we're fearful, we're angry, and more likely to engage in othering and distrust of others. And this is also what makes us susceptible to the appeal of simplistic, emotion-laden discourses that promise to reduce this fugue that creates this situation and provide us with a sense of control and stability and belonging and community, and try to make sense of the world, even if it might be in a very bizarre way. And all of this, as Rico and all have drawn on their work, leads to the kind of social and political instability we're seeing around us in contemporary society. And I can unpack some of this in the questions. And also, I've got limited time, so turning to the individual implications of this. Chronic stress also affects our microbiome, and our microbiome, we now understand, our gut biology now affects our emotional health and mental health, and it also has an impact on our epigenetics. Now, a lot of people think, well, this is not a determinist model, because epigenetics is about the way our experiences in the social environment and the physical environment affect the expression of genes. We now realise that our environment, our DNA is not destiny. Our environment affects the expression of DNA throughout our lifetimes. That's got implications for our mental and physical health. So in a way, social constructionism actually affects us biologically. It's a two-way process. And, you know, by understanding the epigenetic impact of these kind of toxic conditions, it gives us insight into differences in longevity between rich and poor areas, and the way, for example, COVID has impacted more severely on poorer areas, and people are disenfranchised and dislocated in society. Now, I want to finish by saying how important this is, how important that we understand these processes of socialisation at this deeper level. Because what happens to us in our own time, we know that these intergenerational epigenetic effects that affect our emotions, affect us physically, are not only experienced by current generations experiencing those toxic conditions, but can impact on the physical and mental sensitivities and epigenetic condition of subsequent generations. This can be translated to subsequent generations. So in a way, rather than being a deterministic model, what I'm saying is that the social construction of society and how it's organised affects us in the present, but also affects subsequent generations. So it's important that we understand how important it is to challenge the current conditions and produce a world that's more human friendly in future. Thank you very much. And if you want to know more about this, have a look at my paper. Sorry, I messed that bit up, but thank you.